Hello, students. Welcome to this session, which is going to be on chapter 14 from part 2 of S.T. Coleridge's Biographia Literaria. And I'm Dr. Shyaonti Talwar, who will be taking you through this session. So let's look at the opening discussion, which Coleridge gives us. Uh, in fact, why does he write, what does he write in this chapter, and why does he write Biographia Literaria at all? So, in his opening discussion, he focuses on the two cardinal points of poetry, that is, nature and imagination. And the whole purpose of the lyrical ballads, which came out in the year 1798, which had a collection of poems by Wordsworth and Coleridge, they were premised on these two cardinal points of poetry, that is nature and imagination. So they focused on the natural and the supernatural. So in fact, it had been agreed upon that both these aspects, natural and supernatural, would be written about. The subjects that came under these two categories would be used to create poems, and Wordsworth was to write on nature, and Coleridge on the supernatural, right? So because they felt that these had a role to play, and they could be very effective areas around which poems could be composed and works of art could be created. Now, this was a radical breaking away, you can say, from traditional traditional works of poetry or traditional works of literature, where poetry had very fixed kind of poetry had a conventional structure. It had conventional content. It had a conventional way of being narrated, and it had conventional it went around conventional subjects. Right. So what Wordsworth and Coleridge were proposing was quite radical, and it was like a literary breakthrough which they were trying to achieve more than 200 years ago, right? So, and it was a clear rebellion against what had been happening for so long, right? So, so which is why they came up with this whole idea of lyrical ballads. And of course, Wordsworth wrote the preface to lyrical ballads, in which he largely justifies the kind of poems or the kind of works that have gone into the book. Now, what happened was that there were differences between Coleridge and Wordsworth on their views. Though both started on the same ground, gradually they kind of went in two directions, and there were a lot of differences which emerged between Coleridge and Wordsworth's literary viewpoints. And there was additionally an imbalance in the representation of the natural and supernatural. That is, in the representation or the actual number of poems that went into the collection, poems that were natural, based around nature or centered around nature, and the poems that were centered around the supernatural. So, the poems that were centered around nature were far greater in number than the poems around the supernatural. So this led to certain differences, and basically Coleridge thought that an explanation was due, a justification was due, and that is why he came up with Biographia Literaria. So in Coleridge's view, poetry and prose are elementally the same. They have the same elements primarily, but they differ in structure and intent. So, definitely there are structural and intentional differences. That is, poetry has a different intention and prose has a different intention. Otherwise, they may have the same elements. And of course, we know that the structure is very different. Poetry is in verse form, whereas prose is in the form of everyday language, right? Or prosaic language. And in Coleridge's view, poetic genius is something that sustains and modifies images, thoughts, and emotions. And that is why poetry, the art of writing poetry or the ability to write poetry is so much superior, is so much more nuanced than writing prose. Poetry, to compose poetry is a work of genius, because you are not just picking up images and narrating them, but you are choosing images and also choosing the best possible expression to depict those images, to depict those thoughts and those emotions, right? So that was the opening discussion. Now let's look at chapter 14 in a little more detail. So, chapter 14 primarily discusses poetry's nature and function in philosophical terms. And in the process of doing this, Coleridge actually deconstructs Horace, okay, the Greek critic Horace, who had maintained that poetry is to instruct. And there should be a didactic moral intent behind writing poetry. So, Horace came from the classical school of Greek criticism, which believed that the primary aim of poetry is to teach, to educate, to instruct, to pass on moral values, to kind of convey a message that has an explicit moral intent, that is didactic in nature. Didactic is that teaches. That teaches, that imparts some kind of a moral message. And like I said, let me elaborate the two cardinal points that he was talking about. So he says the two cardinal points of poetry, we know what they are. They are the natural and the supernatural, right? Now let us look at how he defines them. He says the power of exciting the sympathy of the reader by a faithful adherence to the truth of nature. So whatever you see around yourself, that is part of nature, right? He says, but poetry has the power to make the natural seem extraordinary, to give the familiar a touch of mystery. And that is what will bring out or will foreground the beauty in nature. That is what will open the eyes of the reader to the beauty, the mystery, the magnificence which is all around us in nature, right? So there's a lot of power, in fact, in nature, but that power can be foregrounded or can reach us only when poetry is composed in such a manner that it celebrates nature, that it makes us look at nature with fresh eyes, that tells us that nature is so very special in so many ways. So that is the first cardinal point he's trying to make. And the second is the power of giving the interest of novelty by modifying with the colors of imagination. So here, well, he's talking about the supernatural realm. So he says, where we rope in or we bring in the supernatural elements and we try to show that these are in fact uh, a part of human experience. These ought to be a part of human experience. So, writing about the supernatural, that which is not easily visible to the naked eye, or that which we are not, that we don't experience easily, right? Right. So now he goes on to elaborate this a little more. He says the first kind of poetry, that is where you excite the sympathy of the reader by a faithful adherence to the truth of nature. He says this is the first kind of poetry, which is all about the sudden charm which accidents of light and shade, which moonlight or sunset diffused over a known and familiar landscape, appear to represent the practicability of combining both. These are the poetry of nature. So he says something that you notice in nature which suddenly inspires you to write, which is so beautiful, which is so glorious, that suddenly you find yourself wanting to write about it, wanting to celebrate it, wanting to appreciate it, wanting to laud it. So So maybe it's a mundane thing, it's an everyday event, like the moon in the sky, or like the sun rising from behind the hills, or say a tree or a brook or a small tiny little flower. But suddenly you look at it with different eyes and you feel, oh, this is celebration worthy, this needs to be celebrated. It's so beautiful, right? And what do you require for that? You require a contemplative and a sensitive mind. So a mind that can meditate over it, that has the sensitivity, that has the depth, that has the passion, or uh, or the proclivity to sense the beauty, the beauty that is inherent in that element. And this is the task that was taken up by Wordsworth, right? So if you look at the poem Daffodils, which I'm sure most of us are familiar with, you will see that the ordinary acquires a semblance of the extraordinary, right? It is just daffodils, which are, daffodils are not even roses, right? A rose still has a cultural value. It is used as a symbol of love, a symbol of friendship. But here the poet is talking of daffodils, which are very, very, like, you look at them and you don't even think about them. But he uh, he walks through the countryside, and he goes past a field of daffodils, and suddenly, he's inspired to create poetry, because the scene strikes him as so beautiful, so enriching to his inner senses, to his spiritual self, that he composes a poem on daffodils. So this is how the ordinary becomes extraordinary, right? The commonplace, the nondescript elements in nature, which we often invisibilize, which we often overlook, which we often fail to notice because we are so preoccupied with our lives. Suddenly, those are being celebrated. So the whole idea was to draw the reader's attention to those elements that were present around the reader, so that the reader could draw inspiration, the reader could draw joy by just becoming more sensitive with uh, what the reader was surrounded by, and also by engaging with nature, by understanding the inherent beauty, vibrance, and momentum in nature, that nature has a life of its own, a life force of its own.